Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the School of Self Worth. I am sitting down this week with Marla Teyolia, a workplace strategist and holistic executive coach with over 20 years of leadership development experience. In this fascinating conversation, Marla shares about the moment she left California and the Mexican indigenous culture she had grown up in and faced a white dominant space, and how that experience jump started her own healing journey. If you're a high achieving leader wondering how to overcome cultural conditioning to step into your own authenticity and power, this conversation is for you. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to welcome Marla Teyolia to the School of Self Worth. And Marla is a workplace strategist and holistic executive coach with over 20 years of leadership development and group facilitation experience. And I am so excited to connect with you, Marla. And I had a connection briefly before, and we were really introduced by a mutual friend. And in the conversation we had, Marla, just that brief one, it was so rich around your experience and development of self worth. So, first, I want to say welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I already, in the short time that I've known you, I feel like I've had such a rich window into that journey for women around self worth. And I'm really curious to hear yours and for you to share, where did that journey begin for you, or the awareness of that journey for you around developing your own self worth?
Beautiful. Thank you. I was in thinking about this question, a few images came to mind. And the first was being in grad school, right? So like many of us who are successful, we're running businesses, we're just doing the damn thing. We tend to be overachievers, right? And we tend to kind of operate and be really productive. And so there's a lot of worth or idea of self-worth that comes with that. And it isn't until we're kind of knocked on our butt a bit or if we're feeling some of the punches that we realize, ooh, there's something here that I need to tend to. And so for me, I think where it really showed up initially was, I'm aging myself at this point, I think it was like 1996. And I was at grad school at Columbia, and it was the first time that I really felt that I was feeling the impacts of white supremacist culture on my mind, on my body, on my spirit. I could feel anxiety. And it had nothing to do with what I was doing or how, quote, productive I was or how well I was doing in classes. That was the easy part. It really had to do with how I felt that I was being othered in my program. That case studies about immigrant families or brown folks were very reflective of my own personal family experience of being in a predominantly white woman's space and how I was marginalized in that space, and the micro and macroaggressions that came through that space, right? And being in that day in and day out and living in New York for the first time. Like, I am from California. I'm a border girl, the only one born on, this side of the border. And there's something about being on this land that was very familiar. And if you've ever been to California, you know that Mexican and indigenous culture is like the tapestry, right? That's woven as a foundation of this land. And being in New York was very different. It was different. It was a city, right? People are packed. It was a lot of energy. And there were markers that I just didn't have access to the same kind of music or food or, this was mid 90s, and Mexicans were a really new immigrant group, mostly from Oaxaca at the time. So it was really hard to even find like traditional foods in the grocery market or even a restaurant that wasn't ridiculously expensive. And so add that on top of being in the first time where I was in a more white dominant space, really took me for a loop. And through that process of understanding, whoa, I'm being impacted here. My mental health is being impacted, my spiritual health, how I'm seeing myself. And more than even seeing myself, just how I was feeling throughout my days, I could realize that there was some tending that needed to happen. And through that process, my then boyfriend, now husband, connected me with an elder who sadly just recently passed away, and her name was Asana Makaru, and she was a healer in the neighborhood in the Fillmore of San Francisco. an elder Black woman who really set me on my path around really reclaiming my spiritual development, really intentionally doing work with ancestors, uh, meditation, all these modalities that were really a reclaiming. But for me, it ended up being very much a journey of self-worth and liberation.
Well, there are so many pieces in there that are really beautiful. And thank you for sharing your story so openly
Mm-hmm.
with us around how, what you're speaking to is sometimes we think that self worth is so on the individual,
Mm-hmm.
but really there's so many cultural pieces to it. And you're not even speaking from that family side, which is where I feel like a lot of women that struggle there. But for your experience was really truly around culture. And
Mm-hmm.
like you said, white supremacist culture and that impact on you. And I'm curious for you that once you started to go down that pathway and that journey, because I feel like sometimes in that journey, it can be very overwhelming because it's not
Mm-hmm.
like you can escape that culture. If you live in the
Mm-hmm.
United States, like there's no way
Mm-hmm.
out of that. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious for you in that journey as you started to unpack that and to really connect, it sounded like much more with yourself and your culture in a deeper way, that how did it allow you to navigate those spaces, or what did it do for you in those spaces? That's what I'm curious.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So when I first started, I met with this elder who gave me a few to-dos right away. And she said, I really think it's really critical that you meditate. Now, for context, born and raised in a very traditional Mexican Catholic family. I did not necessarily practice Catholicism, but I went to Catholic school for high school. And I didn't even know, like, okay, meditation, like, what is that, right? This is mid 90s, very different kind of cultural landscape. And I think a lot of Asian cultures, meditation was something that is imbued within the culture and in some of the religious aspects, depending on where you land. For me, it was like, what am I doing? What, is it just sitting silently? Is it breathing? Like, what is it? Right. So she asked me
Right.
to meditate daily, um, asked me to build up an altar that was very much an ancestor altar. And that felt familiar because as a indigenous kind of Mexican woman, Day of the Dead, like that's something that feels more accessible to me, right? That you make
Right.
altars for your ancestors, and also being raised Catholic, like there's altars, that's a thing. And so that one felt like, okay, that felt accessible to me. Um, and that was really the ask. That was like the main two asks. Like, I need for you to do this every day. And then she gave me kind of some visualization elements that were about really seeing myself really protected and in white light, and walking into spaces with a posse of people with me, right? That were my ancestors and my
Mm.
guides. And so I did that. It became my spiritual armor, if you will. I would not leave the house to even go to the bodega down the corner without meditating every morning. And so it required a level of discipline where at that time I lived in Park Slope, Brooklyn. I was going to Columbia. It was like an hour commute. And about an hour plus to Central Harlem, where I was doing my internship. So I would wake up really early to be able to do all of these rituals to just get on the train, right?
Mm.
And, on the train, rush hour, you're packed like sardines. So before this time, I felt like my energy was already zapped by the time I went to my destination, right? Because you're surrounded by
Right.
people. And so I ended up just really committed to those two practices. And one thing that I witnessed was that once you start following the breadcrumbs that are laid in front of you, like you see more breadcrumbs. And then it became, oh my gosh, I saw a sign for a yoga class. I'm going to try that yoga class out. And I had taken yoga in college, fell asleep almost every session. I was super exhausted. It
Me
wasn't
too.
something that stuck, right? It didn't really stick. But I was like, oh, okay, I'm doing meditation so much. Let me go there. Then from that point on, it was like, ooh, I'm really feeling like I need to kind of cleanse my body. I'm going to become vegan. Like literally one day at a dinner with friends, like I'm being vegan. Like literally right now. I'm like, yes, right now. This chicken tastes gross. I'm being vegan. And so there became this path I felt of really detoxifying, of decolonizing, of cleansing that became from the inside out. And I would say I started these practices somewhere like around October-ish, November of my first semester of grad school. And following spring semester, I was asked to be a trainer for Columbia's incoming orientation or incoming new student orientation, and it was on diversity. And I remember that I had participated as a new student in this diversity training. And there were some activities around, placing yourself on this power and privilege scale or opting in and out based on circles in terms of how you identified. And I remember very distinctly feeling, number one, just really annoyed that like some people didn't even know what being a colonized person was. Like they didn't even understand what that was, right? But also finding that I was rating myself really low on these power and privilege scales, except for a few identities. And when I was asked to be a trainer, part of the training was to go through that experience again. And this time, when I went through the experience, I rated myself totally differently. I was really high on the power and privilege scale. And what I recognized, nothing had changed. Like Columbia was still Columbia and people were still who they were, but I had shifted. And that's when I recognized that my liberation was an inside job, that my sense of personal power and worth were based in very specific and traditional and cultural decolonial practices. And so that was where I recognized that, oh, this was about exercising a muscle and really committing to these practices that built me up, so that I almost was surprised when I realized that, oh no, I'm rating myself totally higher here now. And that was about me. And that was my sense of power had I harnessed it again. And so people were going to be who they're going to be. And the system was going to be what the system was. But I felt powerful. And then I could navigate in a very different way.
Well, what you're saying is so powerful because it's really around taking back the practices of who you are. And you're not saying this specifically, but I can relate to this from the practices of, I'm Chinese American and there's some things that I do. And I'm like, well, this is what I need. It works for me. And this is what I'm going to do, regardless of what you need or don't need. And when I state it more powerfully, like my cultural preferences or food preferences is a big one for me, or whatever that might be, or holidays, or connection, that I state it clearly instead of being like, oh, like that's not acceptable or like that's not white dominant culture, and being in my own power of that. And I relate to that. And I feel like what you're saying is so powerful because it really is from the inside, as much as it can feel like, let's try to change everything outside. And I see that so much with people like, let's change everybody else. And it's like, well, what's happening within yourself? It's like decolonizing yourself, as you said, so that you can actually own your worth in a totally different way.
Absolutely. And then I feel like you're resourced to go do that change making work. Right. And at that point, I felt resourced. And so I could then step up more powerfully for the things I believed in and call folks and systems and organizations to task. I can't do that if I'm totally depleted and I'm not feeling resourced, or I'm exhausted and not feeling that my mental health is at the strongest place it can be, because it's exhausting.
Absolutely. What you're saying is so important. I think this is true for anyone, right? You have to be resourced. You have to be in taking care of yourself, watching out for yourself, being mindful of your boundaries and your mental health before you can actually change the world. And I feel like a lot of people deplete themselves in that way. They're like, oh, well, I'm going to go do everything. And it's like, well, actually, no, it's important to start with you before you can look at everybody else and everything else.
Absolutely.
So
And
I'm
I think that
curious.
we can,
Oh,
go
yeah.
ahead. No, but I think that we
You go
can
ahead.
go to the other side, right? To the extreme of that all of a sudden we think that it's just about self-care. And at that time, I remember, which I found really fascinating. So I, was often one of either the only woman of color or maybe two in any space, right? Whether it was a yoga class, if sometimes we went to the health food store, depending on where we were, we'd go there for a vegan restaurant, right? And my husband was vegan as well. And so I remember so distinctly people being like, oh my God, girl, that's such a white shit to do, right? Like, excuse me, sorry, cursed. But that's just like a white thing to do, right? Like you're trying to be more white. And it was just like, wow, like we had really identified practices of wellness to white and connected to whiteness. And I think
Yeah.
that if the barometer, or barometer is probably not the right word, but if the ask for a person of color who is deeply connected to their culture, if the ask is, I have to let go of my culture in order to be well, we're going to choose culture. And for me, it really became so important to fuse our wellness and my culture, like they were inextricably linked. And when I would come home from school, and, here's this newly vegan person coming back home to my traditional Mexican home right by the border, my mom was so generous in veganizing every Mexican dish for me. Right. So if there was like enchiladas, it was like she would put lentils and spinach in it. Right. Or she would make like tofu mole, or just things that she was trying to make sure that I felt connected and that I wasn't going to do without. And I really appreciate that, because it was something that I hadn't intentionally connected that was critical to my wellness was also my culture and practices that kept me connected to who I am, where I come from, the legacy that I am living out, and to my ancestors, and that I come from a rich people. And if you would look at the, case studies that we were studying in Colombia, that wasn't the case, right? Like people who looked like me, we were stripped of that richness and made out to be case studies. So it was a huge juxtaposition. And that for me was like a missing link.
That's so huge. I love what you're saying, because I came out of yoga world and yoga culture as well, which also felt for me often just like very white, because it was, if I liked smooth, because I was like, well, I like all these things too, because they make me feel good, the meditation practices and all of these other things. And so I love what you're saying around how your culture also makes you feel well. Because I had to go through a phase where I'm like, well, actually eating rice and stir frying, my body feels really good eating that way. So I'm just going to keep eating that way, because that's really works for me. It's what I grew up with. It really works. And it's not sort of what you would call like in that world, like the clean eating, but it's like, it just really works better for me. And so I love how you're talking about that we get to have all of those pieces in our wellness, and especially for women of color, people of color, that your culture is your wellness. And that is such a powerful statement.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm curious for you then, how did that journey, that beginning of your journey, bring you to where you are now in terms of where you see self-worth? Because, you do so much work with women and with companies and cultures around bringing in power. Really, I would say reclaiming power for people. So could you share a little bit more about what you do now?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, it's funny because I graduated from grad school in 98 and left the field really quickly. Maybe like within 6 months, I was like, oh yeah, this was not what I wanted to do, because I was working much more in like a social service sector, nonprofit, industrial complex. And I was like, oh, this felt very much that it was perpetuating certain behaviors or ways of being that enabled folks to stay in the same places because there was an investment for the system to keep them there. And so I left that really quickly and became really committed to following my joy in terms of the kind of work that I did. And so I continued with my practices of meditation, of yoga, of being vegan. And I started to do work in more arts and culture. And I would say in the early 2000s, I ended up doing a training for coaching. And I was working with an organization at the time that wanted me to be a trainer. And so I went in and did their coaching and training program. And it was all around like women and like women's empowerment and leadership. And so I continued to go down this route of what was going to bring me joy. And I ended up starting this whole other company that was really about, my husband was an artist at the time. I mean, he's still an artist, but he was touring a lot. And so I was managing him, and I was bringing lots of arts and culture and community engagement modalities and practices to our touring. And so, but I kept a lot of my women's leadership work. Like I still continue to do it. Right. So at that point I was a consultant in multiple different avenues. And I don't know that I felt like I kind of knew who I wanted to be or what I wanted to be when I grew up. Right. I just knew that I wanted to follow my joy and the things that felt really important to me, where I felt that there was impact. And that had to be, it happened to be with arts, with culture, and women's leadership. And so as that evolved, I continued to do this work as a consultant, but I really still committed to my own development. And so I studied with a curandera, Maestra Elena Avila, who was the author of Woman Who Glows in the Dark. I was her apprentice for 4 years. I ended up continued to develop who I was and follow my own personal interests. 20 plus years later, now I would say probably 8 years ago, I was like, oh, my whole life journey makes sense. Because what I do is I work with pretty senior leaders globally, Black, Indigenous women of color. I help them to heal, to lead, and to rise. And I do that in a way that is incredibly holistic. So typically, women come to me because they're leaders and they're actually experiencing some of the toxicity that I had experienced, right? And they're trying to navigate this landscape and figure out who are they going to be and how do they move forward in a way that feels aligned with their values and who they are and the work that they're trying to impact. When they come to me, they think we're going to talk strategy initially. And that for me is just another level of doing. I actually really pause the work to be like, okay, we have to focus on your being first. And I lead them through a process that gets them to do this reclaiming work. And once you do that, then I feel the strategy is really easy, right? And I absolutely 150% want to upend the belief that Black, Indigenous women of color, that we need more up-leveling in terms of our skills and our jobs. I am not saying that sometimes there isn't kind of tweaking that we have to do, but there is a narrative that if we just had more skills, right? If we just were more skillful in navigating XYZ environment, that that's what would make us successful. And I fundamentally disagree with that, because the women that I work with are brilliant, but they're navigating some really toxic environments. And so our work first starts in shoring them up, connecting them deeply to their values, who they are, what brings the biggest joy, inviting them to engage in these practices to really build up and reconnect with their sources of power. And once they do that, then the system, I would say, the system is a system. It's going to do what it's going to do. But they can then engage in a very different way that becomes very strategic, that helps them meet their goals and then really thrive. So I feel like this journey has made sense 30 years later, right? But it came with me just following my joy and being really deeply committed to my own development and my own learning and my own healing.
It's funny you say that, because I was working with some clients today and we are all like talking about how often we just want the results. We want the answer. We want to know the end. And I said, well, it is actually the journey. And sometimes even myself too, you're like, am I still on the journey? And then you're like, where is it going? But then once you see where all the dots connect, you're like, oh yeah, that made complete sense. So I love
Yeah.
that for you. It took a while for you to
Mm-hmm.
see how it was, all those pieces were coming together.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying in terms of what you teach, because I agree too. I feel like so many women, I was like, well, you already have so much power within you, and you don't
Mm-hmm.
need more skills to navigate the world you're in. You already successfully got to that place. You understand how
Mm-hmm.
to navigate it, right? It's more about what's within that we want to work on, so you can rise in the way that feels really authentic and genuine to you, rather than what
Mm-hmm.
other people think or want from you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm curious for you then, where would you say, and this is the question I'm always curious about with women who are really, have stepped into and claimed their own power, where they still feel like they get to the edge of it and it kind of gets a little shaky, or like the place where you're stretching right now currently
Mm-hmm.
for yourself.
Yeah, yeah. So, when you read the bio, I was like, oh yes, that all that is true. However, what is not, that I have not intentionally put on the bio, is that I do a lot of healing work, and I hold my coaching work as sacred, and it is healing work, and it is my medicine work, because I bring the experience of studying with the curandera, mindfulness and meditation, yogic practices, and ancestral practices for 20 plus years. That has been part of the journey that has really I would say, reminded me of the necessity to do the decolonizing work within ourselves, right? And as somebody who is indigenous to this land and comes from a colonized people, part of what colonization did was it stripped us of our medicine, right? And stripped us of these practices that reminded us of our sacredness and connection to the ecosystem of life. So what I feel like I've actually grown into, which is part of why I'm so successful at what I do, but it's not something that I've actually been out with, right? That I don't build myself as someone who really works in a medicine woman way, right? So when we have one-on-one engagements with clients, right? I'll do these VIP days where people fly in to work with me, or I'll do these deep dive engagements with groups. This one woman that I worked with, who was actually a friend and came to one of my sessions really early on when I was centering my work, very specifically with women of color. We were doing this deep work and very much leadership development, but very much healing work. She turns to me and she's like, I had no idea how badass you were in the how you did it. And what she was really saying was, I didn't realize that we were going to go to these deep spiritual healing places. And so for me, it's really been about coming out as somebody who is really doing medicine work within this corporate environment to support leaders, and not just corporate environment, but a lot of women do come to me who are at senior levels worldwide to say, I'm struggling here. And the traditional models of coaching aren't working for me. What's missing? And a lot of it is their own spiritual development. So I feel like I'm finally really owning that I live and operate in the intersection of personal, professional, and spiritual development.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
I love that because I feel like that is so true for so many, because it's like it says, executive coach, leadership growth, but really there's a deeper level of work for you
Absolutely.
to say that you're doing it. It's not that you're not doing it, but to actually say that to people.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that there's, when I have one-on-one meetings or chemistry meetings with potential clients, I always share that I call myself a holistic executive coach. One, because nothing is off the table. You get to be a whole person in this space. But also, like, I'm really interested in going to the deeper level. So if you are looking for somebody who is going to just tell you what to do or give you more strategies of doing, I am not the person. But if you're interested in really peeling back the layers to get to some core strengths, some core issues, some core wounds, and you want to work on healing back, because ultimately that shows up in life, right? It shows up in how we lead. It shows up in how we love. It shows up in how we live, right? If you're willing to go to those deep places, and I will bring in lots of modalities that may be non-traditional, then we can work together. Right? But you have to be willing for that ride, right? And sometimes people are so in their heads that they think it's just a strategy piece. And we will go there, but that's not where we're going to start.
Well, it brings up something because I feel similarly about the kind of work that I do. Like, I don't say that I'm a spiritual teacher, but really many of my clients say that to me as well. And if you feel like for so many people, they reach for the strategy because they don't even realize how much they need that. And is if your experience is actually that's what's missing for so many people. And this is like a really big cultural question too, right? Because I feel like in our culture so much, I felt this during yoga, that people were really lost because they didn't have spiritual guidance that felt healthy and that felt clean and felt like it was directing them into true source places, right? And I'm just curious what you think of that, because that came to mind as you were speaking.
I mean, I 120% agree. Sometimes not sometimes, I would say a lot of times when we're in the work with women and we're peeling back the layers, it's like they're almost surprised at, oh, we had to go to this. I thought we were focusing on A, but we are focusing on Z. Oh my God, I had no idea. And then once you focus on Z, like A is so much easier. right? Because honestly tends to be just a manifestation of some kind of core wound or core ouch that is driving your behavior and how you're showing up or driving limitation for you. And that's not to say, I want to be really clear, I'm not talking about blaming anybody for the systems that we're living in. But it is about recognizing that there are patterned ways and imprints that can be legacy burdens for us, that are ancestral burdens, that are cultural burdens, that are just about what it means to, walk on this earth at this moment in time that we've internalized. And when we get to that deep place, I feel like that is the most liberation work that they can do. And it often is for them, right? Because there's a way in which we've been conditioned to operate in spaces where we have to put on masks or we have to fit in certain boxes, or we are told that that where we come from and parts of our struggles and our stories are not to be brought forth in this space. And there was a mentor of mine. Her name is Dr. Kimberly Richards, and she is the executive director of the People's Institute for Surviving and Beyond. And I met her maybe 10 years ago. It was part of an Undoing Racism workshop. And she talked about that as people of color, the higher that we move up the ranks in corporate or leadership positions, the more critical it becomes that we be deeply connected to our culture and to our practices, because those environments will eat you up and they expect that you are going to conform to their culture. So if you do not have practices that tether you to who you are and where you come from, you start to feel lost. And there are deep ramifications for you spiritually, emotionally, and physically. And I ultimately feel like the work that I'm doing is help heal that connection. I'm just helping them heal that retethering. Because once they can do that work, the source of power is limitless.
Well, everything you were saying is so resonant for me. And I love that that is what you do. It is remarkable. And I feel like, especially for women of color, it can be easy to forget because you get so wrapped up in everything else that's happening or what you're trying to conform to, rather than remembering that everything you need to know already exists and it needs really more reinforcement than anything to make sure that that's anchoring you as you're doing everything out in the world that we're in.
And it's a reclaiming, right? Because so many of us have been, detribalized, or there's such a driver of assimilation, right? As somebody whose family is from Mexico, being an quote immigrant in this country, even though we're indigenous to this land, there was really a push, right, to be more American, but not too American, right? Because we still want you to connect with our culture, but yet that you can succeed and that it's just about hard work and it really is a meritocracy, right? And when you come to find out that that's not always really the case, right? We don't live just in meritocracy. There are real systems in place. It can feel like a bucket of cold water, right? Especially if you've been indoctrinated in that, right? And just out of love, right? Our families do that fully out of love, that they want us to succeed and feel that the world is our oyster. And then all of a sudden you're in systems where you're like, oh, wow, this is actually, I'm not really welcome here, even though I'm supposed to be welcome here, right? Oh, I'm really being othered. Like there's real impact that has on us. And depending on what our journey up until that point has been like, it can be incredibly destabilizing.
Yeah. And I love that you speak to it, because that is always the first step, is to recognize it and then say, okay, what can I do to help myself get into that anchoring and stabling? Which leads me to ask you, like, what would you recommend for someone starting this journey? What would be that first anchoring way? Like what is an easy practice or something simple that they could begin today for themselves to really get back into their center?
Yeah. I am a really firm believer in breath work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it could be as simple as sitting up beginning of your day for 5 minutes and setting a timer and just doing deep breathing, right? Our bodies are on constant alert living in this world right now. And deep breath and breathing techniques will start to give your body a sense of safety.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have a sense of safety, possibility tends to open up for you, right? Creativity opens up. Like all research shows that when we are feeling under attack, our prefrontal cortex, right, where a lot of executive functioning lives and creativity lives, it really shuts down and becomes impaired. And so I think it's really critical that when we are talking about the journey of self-worth, it's about really loving up on your body, the physical container that you are in. Like that is the perfect place to start, right? I would really highly recommend that folks try to clean up their diet in the best way they see fit, like removing those colonized and engineered foods and sweeteners and preservatives. Like that's another way in which your body will feel under assault. And we don't really think of it that way. But as somebody who recently came out of a health issue from the vaccine, really caused havoc in my body, I've had to really clean up my diet. And I had a pretty damn good diet before this. But my body started to respond to anything that it identified as a stressor.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really encourage, like, that's actually very much within our control. It requires some preparation, but it's very much in our control to say, oh, I'm really going to cut down on packaged foods, but perhaps have some fruit instead,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because those chemicals, our bodies experience them as stressors. And if we're already having external stressors, don't add more internal stressors.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Those are so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that as like simple ways, right? That
Simple.
we can all start to support ourselves.
Absolutely. And then I think that when you start taking away just even some of the food stressors, this weekend, for example, I had a whole bunch of dark chocolate. And on Monday, I didn't have any chocolate and I started to have a headache. I was like, oh, wow. Like my body had become really attuned to like, give me the sugar, give me the sugar. And so there's a way in which you might actually not feel good for the first week or so of when you start taking some of the stuff out. But
Yeah.
then you realize, oh my God, it was really stressing my body out. And
Yeah.
it's been fascinating because I had dealt with this heart issue that I could see, depending on my foods, how my heart rate would rise because my body had to work harder to really be
Mm-hmm.
processing
Mm-hmm.
this out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So helpful. Well, I love hearing that because there's so many different ways we can do things. And then you could do
Mm-hmm.
something really simple for yourself, like breathe deeply
Mm-hmm.
and maybe cut some of the sugar that you're eating or whatever, some
Yes.
processed foods you're doing and see what your experience is like after that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Amazing. All right. Well, Marla, are you ready for your rapid fire questions?
I am.
Okay. I promise you it'd be easy and nice. Okay. So, what was the last thing that you watched on TV if you're a TV watcher?
I am a TV watcher. Okay, what was the last thing? Oh my God, Beef from
Oh, I heard
Netflix.
that's great. I haven't watched it
It's
yet.
so good. I binged watched it all weekend. It was so good.
I love Ali Wong. I've heard it's
Oh,
great.
yeah, phenomenal.
Awesome.
They're all phenomenal in it, actually.
Amazing. I love that. Okay. What is on your nightstand?
Oh, there's a few different things. Actually, if I took a picture of my nice, I'd be like, oh my God, really? There's like 20 books. There's like books on the bottom. I start and then I finish and don't finish. So right now I'm doing one on the Toltec's, I don't know, it's like Toltec's Secret of Dreaming. So dreams are actually a big portal of information for me. And I have very freakishly prophetic dreams and it's a lot. And so to know that there's a tradition in Mexican culture, in ancient Mexican culture, that dreams as a portal for understanding our world was fascinating to me. So that's the one I'm reading right now.
Very cool. I know I have a huge
Mm-hmm.
stack next to my bed at all
Yeah.
times. Okay. When is the last time you tried something new and what was it?
Who was the last time I tried something new? What was it? That's a great question. So I would say that this feels like a new but not new. So when I got sick, I knew I had to detoxify my body. And I ended up literally just from, again, a dream, waking up and being like, oh, I have to do panchakarma, which is this Ayurvedic detoxification system. Had no idea what panchakarma really was, to be perfectly honest. I just knew that it was a detoxification system, and I had a dream that I was supposed to do it. So I was like, I have to do it. So I found this practitioner out here at the spa here in Santa Monica. And it has been game changing in terms of the practices of just living that have supported my body. And I am just loving it. It's very much upending the belief that, like, to be healthy, you have to have like salads and smoothies and all of the what, in California, it's very much part of like the wellness culture. It's really about cooked foods and practices to calm your nervous system that include like herbs and oils and just even times of day of how you're kind of walking through the world. And it has been game changing and super joyful, and just super luxurious to be like, oh, I have to oil up my body with warm oil before I get in the shower in the morning. And it's incredible. Like, it's so lovely and divine, and it's just awesome.
I love that. That sounds amazing. That
It
sounds
is pretty
amazing.
awesome.
Okay, final question. What
Mm-hmm.
are your top 3 most used emojis on your phone?
All right, let me see. I'm sure there's like a heart in there somewhere. All right, I'm going to literally pull up my phone right now and see what comes up. It's 100% prayer hands, a woman dancing, and then laughing is like a fourth.
Awesome. I love that. I love it. I always feel like it's so fun to see how people use like the way they're communicating through emojis to other
Yeah, yeah,
people.
yeah.
And I use the laughing one all the time too. So,
Right.
so great. Well, Marla, what a joy to have you on and
Thank
sharing
you.
the of your experience and your wisdom. And where can people reach you? Where can they find out more?
Yeah, so my website is cultureshift.agency. That is the website for the company. I am reinstating my marlateyolia.com. It's not live yet, although the email still works. But that's going to be much more my healing work and the retreats for women of color.
Amazing. Well, if you're a woman of color leader really looking for support, I couldn't recommend Marla more. She's been just such a
Awesome.
fount of wisdom. So check her
Yes.
out. And I'm just so grateful you're here helping support people in their growth and self-worth in the School of Self-Worth. So thank you so much for being with
Thank you
us.
so much. And can I actually add one more thing? I would
Please.
put pause and press play retreat.com. So that is a retreat that I run with my partner, Crystal McCreary. And it is a retreat that we do for BIPOC women in Mexico that's happening this June for a week.
Beautiful. Love it. Check
Awesome.
that out as well. And we'll link everything as well in the show notes.
Very cool.
Marla, thank you so much for being here.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much.